Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my Stadia YouTube channel. I'm going to be letting you know why Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cinderella is suddenly closing in the West End. The timing of this could be considered reactionary to the Olivier Awards. Cinderella had a significant snub where it only received one nomination. There is definitely fallout after a Tony Awards season where you see shows that did not do well, that had been hoping to do well, will close in the following weeks. Well, it's happened. The day we all saw coming, but none of us expected to come quite so soon. And if you thought the West End production of Cinderella was a costly mistake, I can only imagine the financial disaster that it has been on Broadway. My name is Mickey Joe, and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional critic, theatre pundit, and content creator, and for some time now, I have been covering Andrew Lloyd Webber's Bad Cinderella, or just Cinderella as it was once called. Once upon a time. Simpler times, weren't they? I've been following this show since before its West End production, and then for the duration of that run that was marred by controversy and then an early closure. And like many of you, I have been so deeply invested in the show's unexpected early arrival to Broadway, where it opened at New York's Imperial Theatre towards the end of March. However, yesterday, on the 10th of May, it was announced that the production would be closing on the 4th of June. It isn't lost on me that this is almost a year to the day when the West End production set its own June closing date. It closed at the Gillian Lynn Theatre on the 11th of June, which really does illustrate what a fast turnaround this was to bring the show to Broadway, and one that I think we can now all agree was slightly too hasty. In terms of my thoughts on this closing, obviously it is incredibly sad when any show has to close prematurely. It is not natural for theatres to be dark. There are already too many dark theatres on Broadway, proving to us what a challenging time it is to produce theatre. Just last week, Bad Cinderella's next-door neighbour Dancin' at the Music Box Theatre also announced that they would be closing. And most of all, I'm sad for all of the people who will be losing their employment because of this early closure. I'm sad for the cast, this hard-working, talented, resilient cast who did not sign up to the social media circus that they have subsequently endured. And if you go and watch my review of Bad Cinderella on Broadway, you will hear me say nothing but praises for this deeply talented cast. Just like I did in London, this show has long attracted very talented and very capable performers to its ranks. Also not forgetting the backstage crew, the front of house team, and everyone else attached to this production who is now going to be out of work. If there was one silver lining to the closing in London, it was that this very talented cast were largely able to go on to bigger and better things, and I am wishing for nothing but success for the Broadway company. Now, I'm not necessarily surprised that this is happening. The writing has been spray painted on the wall for some time now, and yet I heard the rumours, just as I'm sure that you did, that they were going to attempt to buy a principal performer out of their contract so they could bring in some sort of a celebrity stunt cast to inject a little further life, by which I mean money, into the show. And so a part of me is relieved that we didn't have to endure the indignity of what that was about to turn into, though it would have been fascinating to see who they thought would save this show. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking through this closing. I'm going to be letting you know about all of the clues over the past few weeks that this was approaching. I'm going to explain a little bit about why it's closing. If you're not too sure about why this is happening, there are a great many factors at play here. And we're going to talk about what happens now for Bad Cinderella and Andrew Lloyd Webber. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe. I have made so many videos about this show on my channel. If you don't know the history of all of this, I suggest you go back and watch the playlist I have made that has all of them in. That will bring you right up to speed. There's also a bunch of links in the description of this video. You can sign up to become one of my channel members to get early and exclusive access to videos. You can also try and predict the winners of this year's Tony Awards and win a $1,000 TodayTix theatre voucher. Now, let's talk about Bad Cinderella closing on Broadway. So like I said, it's almost a year to the day that we had the same announcement from the West End production that would be closing in June. And there are a few similarities and a few differences here, because discernibly that production ran for a lot longer, albeit with a slight interruption in the middle due to some COVID-related shutdowns. Because in the West End, Cinderella opened in the summer, months before awards season, whereas on Broadway it opened at the end of March, just a month before the Tony eligibility cutoff. Another difference between the two is that the critical reception in London was actually much fonder responder. Many critics, who are historically very harsh in their criticism, had lovely things to say about Cinderella. It was one of the first major openings coming out of the pandemic. Andrew Lloyd Webber had been very vocal against the shutdown of theatres and trying to push for their reopening, so many people were championing him as this hero of theatre. And not to be too cynical about it all, but I do think that there was this idea among the theatre community that we needed to push this show and help support the industry. I think that because I saw the show 3 times in London, I saw it again on Broadway, and my feelings were largely the same. I enjoyed it slightly less on Broadway for various reasons that I've already explained, but for the most part, the show did not change all that much. So for the reviews to have been so much worse on Broadway, I think was just the critics being a little bit more honest. And they were bad. They were an absolute bloodbath. There is a whole video where I talk through some of the worst of them and recap what was said. If you want, you can go and watch that. But a major difference between London and New York audiences is that the critical reception to a show seems to have a much bigger impact on Broadway. In the West End, many audiences disregard the critics or don't really engage with reviews, whereas on Broadway, perhaps because the tickets are more expensive and people want to know what they're getting themselves in for if they're making a larger investment in their entertainment, people really do read those reviews, and it can kill a show. But Bad Cinderella wasn't killed off straight away. It held out for the Tony nominations. These were announced last week, and Cinderella, along with a few other shows like A Beautiful Noise, the Neil Diamond musical, which is still running, and Dancin', which already has announced its closing, did not receive any nominations whatsoever. This is not too different from the London production that only received 1 nomination for Victoria Hamilton Barrett as the stepmother for Best Supporting Actress in a Musical. For both productions, the show itself, its leading lady, and Andrew Lloyd Webber as its composer were snubbed. So on the face of it, it would look like the Broadway production was much less successful because its run was shorter. And in fact, the 2 productions did have a similar timeline in one respect. Both of them closed shortly after these awards snubs. In London, the production stayed open until after the Olivier Awards themselves, and then announced closing, possibly because Andrew Lloyd Webber's ego had been bruised, or possibly just because the show was not making enough money to stay open. And on Broadway, the closing announcement has come just a week after the Tony Award nominations were announced. It will not even make it to the broadcast. It's worth saying as well, shows just close faster on Broadway because it is very expensive to keep a show running. Bad Cinderella allegedly represents an investment of around $20 million that evidently it has not and will not recoup. So why has this production closed? There are parts of this story that we know and parts that we may never know. Certainly when it opened in New York, it was doing so with a pre-existing reputation, which if we're being completely honest, I probably didn't help with, so sorry. But like the journalists who have been covering this story in print, I am simply documenting what has happened with this show. Like I said at the start of this video, the West End run of this production was plagued by controversy. You had the alleged phone call that Andrew Lloyd Webber made to all of the cast lambasting them for this negative review that had come out in the New York Post. One of the first reviews written by an American critic, Johnny Oleksinski, who when he reviewed the show again on Broadway called it a wacko dumpster fire, and very recently penned an article talking about how its closure was imminent because it was hemorrhaging money. Then you have the closing announcement itself. This was put out on social media only shortly after the cast were notified, but without the incoming cast, those who were set to replace at the show's imminent cast change, having been told. People found out they were losing a year's worth of employment via Twitter. In fact, the show's leading lady, Carrie Hope Fletcher, had not been in the building that day. She was not scheduled to perform, and she only found out in advance of it going out on social media because she was told by another member of the cast, and not by production. Flash forward to the show's closing, which Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber did not attend. However, director Lawrence Connor did read out a letter from him, a letter which described the show as a costly mistake. And whether he meant for this to sound as bad as it did, I do not know, but it was at the very least a clumsy remark. One that the cast visibly reacted to. They were both incredulous and somehow completely unsurprised, which says a lot about the way they were all treated during this time. So all of this in the rearview mirror proved to be a lot of baggage for the show when traveling to New York for a very quick opening. An opening that had always been in the works before the West End closure had been announced. In fact, Linady Janeo, the show's star, had already been cast prior to this. Another factor in the closing is obviously the reviews that I have already mentioned. It was eviscerated, particularly by the papers that really mattered, the New York Times and the Post. Audiences were advised to bring eye plugs and earplugs, and if such a thing existed, soul plugs. Some of the worst things that could be said about a show were said about this production. And the fact that the show had rebranded itself as Bad Cinderella rather than simply Cinderella just gave them more fodder to work with, as many predicted it would. Then we have the complete lack of Tony Award nominations, not even for Carolee Carmello, not even for the costume design, nor for the orchestrations or Andrew Lloyd Webber's score. This seemed very pointed because in a few of those categories, the show definitely does have enough merit to be considered for nomination, but it felt like a very conscious choice to shut them out completely. Now, I'm of the opinion that the show could actually have survived this. I don't think that after all of the terrible reviews that the Tony Award nominations would have been able to save it, because it wouldn't have been able to outrun this narrative of being critically loathed. Post-opening, all that this show had going for it was its online notoriety and audience intrigue. And that's not the worst thing in the world, because A, all publicity is good publicity. There are many shows that would love to be talked about as much as Bad Cinderella has been talked about. And B, though we hate to admit it, sometimes we love to watch a car crash. Unfortunately, what did seal the fate of this show was its lack of broader commercial appeal. If there had been a star name in the cast, if it had been based on a film, if it had some sort of other commercial draw, you'll notice at the time of me filming this video, and I may be proven wrong, A Beautiful Noise, the Neil Diamond musical, has not announced closing. That is still gaining audiences who are Neil Diamond fans. They have a reason to go and see that. Perhaps the Andrew Lloyd Webber fans who want to go and see his work on Broadway have spent all of their money going to see Phantom in its last few expensive weeks at the Majestic. But Bad Cinderella has never known who it was selling itself to. It has always had this branding crisis. In fact, the show has rebranded multiple times. Not only its title, but just about everything about the marketing of this show has changed from the original version that we saw years ago in London. As recently as a few weeks ago in the US, the show was still trying to pivot its marketing approach. Ultimately, unsuccessfully. But what's key here is that is not the fault of any particular marketing agency or anyone who has worked on this show. It's really to do with the material. If the material was marketable, it would be easy to market. The fact that so many different professionals working on this show haven't known how to effectively market it is because the material itself is confused and misguided. I don't know who this show is meant to be for. The show itself doesn't know who it's meant to be for, and various professionals have no idea who to deliver this show to because it just doesn't have an audience. So by the time that last week's grosses emerged, it became very clear that Bad Cinderella was struggling hugely. Its average capacity was only 54% and it grossed just over $320,000, making it the lowest grossing musical on Broadway of that week. So I mentioned this article to you before that Johnny Oleksinski had written in the New York Post. Bad Cinderella hemorrhaging cash as 2023 Tony noms approach. Obviously, we now know how that story ends. I was shocked from the opening paragraph because he revealed here that the advertising agency RPM and the production had cut ties. We then have a statement from producer Christine Schwartzman. You will notice that she is doing a lot of the talking in this article and not Andrew Lloyd Webber. In fact, I have it on good authority that him and his production company had a less active role in the show's Broadway run. Possibly because of what happened in London, possibly because of other factors going on in his personal life. Christine Schwartzman said the change has been made to work more strategically to find our audience, which didn't work. Setting this new course, we found ourselves not aligned with our previous marketing agency in terms of steps that needed to be taken. We agreed to part ways and wish them the best. A person close to RPM, however, and we all know what that really means, said that the campaign was the only good thing about the maligned musical and that the agency had resigned the account, which I hope so, because if they had been fired, that would have been the worst choice Bad Cinderella has made since it opened on Broadway. Just a side note here about RPM. Not only do I think they were doing a fantastic job, but they are also the reason that I was able to go and review the show in an official capacity. You got that Bad Cinderella Broadway review on my channel because RPM let it happen. They are absolutely right that the social media campaign that they were executing on behalf of this show was the only good thing about this Broadway production. It had effectively made me renew interest and faith in the show when they put out everything that they did ahead of the Broadway production starting previews. Whether you liked it or not, the show had an enormous presence, it had a discernible voice, they weren't taking themselves too seriously, but this tongue-in-cheek approach, it would seem, did not sit well with the producers. An incredulous source was quoted as saying that Schwartzman wants all the advertising to look like Rodgers and Hammerstein, which would in fact be pivoting back to how the show was marketed in London, not initially, but when they did their first marketing pivot. And taking this show, this campy and strange show, and trying to brand it as this classical fairy tale did not work then, and it certainly wouldn't have worked on Broadway. As it stood, they didn't do an enormous marketing pivot, but we did start to see a few changes on their social media posts. On their Instagram feed, we've seen them putting out these glossy and glamorous graphics recently, and what's even stranger is the posts that have been on TikTok. So for some time, there has been a notorious TikTok account that had bootlegged many parts of the show and posted them online. Ahead of the first preview performance, the Bad Cinderella Twitter account had asked people not to bootleg the show, but recently they seem to have changed their approach, reposting one of these bootlegs on TikTok and tagging the person who had uploaded it and saying, "We just want to be friends." They even changed their TikTok profile picture of the official show to a clip from the bootleg. What is this behavior? Were they trying to be cool and down with the kids and pro-bootleg? That would have been a very unique stance, but it certainly would have endeared them to a younger audience who is very pro-bootleg, many of them. And yet this was not the end, because they then released a few professionally recorded clips and tried to clap back at the bootlegger by tagging them again in the description and saying, "Which version do you like better?" Which was a particularly misguided post. It felt a lot like punching down, and it just brought attention to the fact that the show had been bootlegged in the first place. The one thing they don't need to do is hype up their own notoriety. Everyone is already talking about this show and has been for some time. In the last few days even, the show has made more last-ditch attempts to try and gain some interest. They live streamed the start of the second act, which, if you're facing imminent closure, I think throw everything at the wall and try and make something work and see if there's any way to try and gain some more traction. Again, I don't think this show had the issue of people not knowing about it or people not having seen its content. It's just that they didn't want to buy tickets. So I don't think live streaming the second act was ever going to really help. The second act opening is a decent enough part of the show to sell it. It's not as much fun as it was in London when the stalls actually rotated around and the stage moved around the auditorium. But I do give them props for trying on that front. It was a strange idea, but, you know, when faced with no alternative, why not? Something that a lot of people had sent to me that they thought was a clue that the show was closing, that I don't think was the fact that Lady, who plays Cinderella on Broadway, posted about auditioning for another project. Now, much as you might think that this shows she knows the show is going to close imminently and she needs to get another job, it's really not how it works, because the timeline of auditioning is so much longer than you might expect. She was cast as Cinderella almost a year before she opened in the show. So many actors, even in successful shows that are going to run, will often be auditioning for other projects. This is just the reality of being a working actor. So I said I would tell you what happens now. Obviously, Bad Cinderella is going to close on Broadway on June the 4th at the Imperial Theatre. We have seen these things getting extended in the past. Phantom had an initial closing date, which was then later extended. That's happened before with other Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron Mackintosh shows, like Cats. I don't envision that happening with Bad Cinderella. I think they have already lost such a substantial amount of money. A lot of people are calling for the show to be professionally filmed. That is not something that I think they have the capital for at this time. Again, I don't know who the market for that would be, beyond all the people who want to watch it because they have been watching these videos about it on the internet and they are just so intrigued. In terms of the Broadway ecosystem, the Imperial Theatre is now available for new tenants, as is the Music Box Theatre next door. There are a handful of currently dark theatres on Broadway that have no newly announced shows. And I feel as though many of the theatres on Broadway are dark for longer periods than those in the West End. I think that's because it's more of a challenge to raise the initial funds needed to put a show on Broadway than it is in the West End. We see shows transferring into unexpectedly vacant West End theatres for limited runs quite often. One thing that everyone has been talking about in terms of this closing is Andrew Lloyd Webber losing his streak on Broadway. Because as a composer, he has had a musical running in New York for 43 uninterrupted years. This, for the most part, being because of the enormous run of The Phantom of the Opera, and it seems fitting for that streak to end with the closing of Phantom. That was his legacy in New York. Whether there is any truth to the idea that the Bad Cinderella opening was timed so that the streak could continue past Phantom's closing, I do not know. But honestly, I do not think he cares. I don't think he cares nearly as much as all of the people who are speculating about this. I think Theatre TikTok cares a lot more about this streak than Andrew Lloyd Webber actually does. He already has this enormous achievement on Broadway. It's not like there is any other composer who is even close to rivaling this, and if they do, it will only be because of the run of one show, like a Chicago or a Hamilton. No one else has had this kind of back-to-back success going back so many decades. According to that same New York Post article that I was reading from earlier, he actually wanted for the show to close previously, and it was Christine Schwartzman, the producer, who was keeping the show open for longer. I also think there are other factors at play here. Obviously, he has recently mourned the death of his son, for which I have only the most sincere condolences. I don't think carrying on his streak on Broadway is really at the forefront of his priorities. Do I think that Bad Cinderella, or just Cinderella if it reverts to its original title, will have any kind of a future life? Honestly, I have no idea. I don't know if the notoriety of this show is going to go anywhere. I don't know if 10 years down the line someone wants to announce this big, splashy revival of it and try and benefit from the scandal of its original runs. Certainly not on Broadway, where it's very hard to get investors interested in something that famously flopped. We might see an off-West End production, maybe we'll see an attempt at a UK return, or a tour. I feel like that would be very misguided, but I went on record and said I didn't think the Broadway transfer was going to happen, and I was proven wrong. Ultimately, was I correct that it shouldn't have happened? Probably. A lot of money has been lost, but I've long since stopped trying to second guess the decisions made about this show. Do you know what I think they need? I think they need a European production, because there are many shows that did horribly on Broadway that have had extended lives in Europe, and they often have this slightly strange and offbeat and campy vibe with this gothic element and these grand costumes. I think Bad Cinderella would actually go down very well in mainland Europe. It can play in rep with Dance of the Vampires that continues to enjoy ongoing success despite being a massive Broadway flop. So European producers, if any of you are watching this video, let's go get some schnitzel and talk about this. As for me, it feels like this could be the end of what has become a multi-year Bad Cinderella saga. When I made that first video years ago about how I wasn't really vibing with the show before we really knew that much about it, I wasn't anticipating all of this. I wasn't anticipating my channel becoming synonymous with the fall of this musical. And as the show approaches its final performance, maybe I will make one more video here on my channel documenting what went wrong with the show's Broadway run. Although honestly, I feel like I've said most of it already. But just in case I do, make sure to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel so you do not miss it. If you want to see the rest of my videos before everyone else does and see some exclusive content as well, you can sign up to become one of my channel members. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Thank you for waiting for this one. Thank you everyone who tagged me in all of the closing announcements. I saw it straight away because my phone just about exploded. It brings me no joy whatsoever to make this kind of a video about a closing, but I hope that maybe I have answered some of your questions. If there's anything else that you would like to know, any other videos that you would like to see, let me know in the comments section down below. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!